The sun hung heavy over the red Oklahoma dust as the crack of a wooden bat split the still air. On one side of the field stood Corporal James Jimmy Dawson, glove raised, squinting against the glare. On the other, unbelievably, stood Alexei Vronsky, the son of a captured Russian soldier once forced to fight in a German uniform. The ball soared, and everyone cheered Americans, Russians, and even a few German POWs on cleanup duty near the diamond. It was July 1944. The United States was at war with the Axis powers, yet inside Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, enemy's children played baseball with American Guards' kids. That sound, the laughter, the cheering, the mingling of two worlds said more about America's moral power than any weapon in its arsenal. The Camp of Paradoxes, Camp Gruber, sprawled across 65,000 acres near Braggs, Oklahoma. It was built to train American infantry, but had become one of over 500 POW camps across the United States. Nationwide, 425,000 Axis prisoners were being held on American soil. Of those, several thousand were not German by birth. They were Russians, Ukrainians, Poles men captured on the Eastern Front, conscripted by Hitler's Wehrmacht to fill the ranks of his dying armies. They were the forgotten ones, the in-between soldiers. When captured by the Allies, they faced certain execution if returned to Stalin. But in America, they found something they hadn't expected: decency. According to U.S. Army records and Red Cross inspection reports from 1944, the Oklahoma camps ran like small towns: theaters, infirmaries, bakeries, even chapels. POWs worked farm details, learned trades, and earned money to buy cigarettes and candy at the camp canteen. Each man received 3,500 calories per day, more than the average US civilian under wartime rationing. Their quarters were heated, clean, and inspected weekly by the Swiss Red Cross. But in Camp Gruber, something unprecedented happened: family reunification. The reunited families. When US forces liberated refugee centers in Italy and North Africa, they found wives and children of captured Eastern soldiers stateless, starving, unwanted by any government. Some were the families of Soviet-born POWs held in US custody. Against every rule of wartime policy, a small group of American officers led by Lieutenant Colonel William Teague, a logistics officer stationed at Gruber, petitioned Washington to bring these families together. In 1944, approval came through under a humanitarian clause of the War Department's Civilian Relief Initiative. So, in a twist that seemed almost absurd during total war, a handful of Soviet POWs saw their families step off US Army transport trucks and walk into the same fenced compounds that had once symbolized defeat. Instead of barbed wire and fear, they found gardens, libraries, and even a baseball field. One of those reunited soldiers was Sergeant Mikhail Misha Vronsky, a Red Army mechanic captured in Italy while serving under the German 715th Infantry Division. His wife, Anna, and daughter, Sophia, were discovered in a displaced persons camp outside Naples. When she arrived in Oklahoma, locals stared not in hate, but in awe. Anna's first sight of America was the green line of cottonwood trees around the camp and a child running up to offer her a Hershey bar. Vronsky wrote in his journal, later archived by the Red Cross, "I was prepared to die a traitor. Instead, my daughter eats bread with milk. My wife smiles. I am a prisoner, but freer than I ever was." It's hard to overstate how shocking this was to the rest of the world. In Nazi camps, Soviet prisoners were executed en masse. In Stalin's Soviet Union, any soldier who surrendered was branded a dog and sent to Siberia. But in America, the same America that had been attacked at Pearl Harbor, that was sending its sons to die in Normandy and Saipan, these same enemies were being fed, clothed, and loved. The guards who changed history, Corporal Dawson, who manned the guard tower at Gruber, remembered the transformation vividly. At first, he wrote to his mother, "I didn't like the idea of feeding men who wore the enemy's colors, but then I saw their kids. You can't look at a hungry child and not share your lunch." Soon, the camp's baseball field became the social heart of the compound. Prisoners crafted gloves out of burlap and string. They carved bats from local oak, and every Saturday, after work details and roll call, the guards would open the gates of the inner yard not to release prisoners, but to invite them to play. The scoreboard, hand-painted by POWs, read, "Team Liberty versus Team Moscow." When a visiting Red Cross inspector asked Teague why he allowed the games, he answered simply, "Because it reminds everyone that we're human first, soldiers second. The shock heard, around the world. When word of these conditions reached Berlin and Moscow, reactions were immediate and furious. German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels denounced the reports as Anglo lies designed to corrupt the minds of loyal soldiers. Soviet intelligence, meanwhile, quietly panicked. The NKVD feared that returning POWs would spread tales of American generosity. They were right. By war's end, thousands of Soviet POWs begged not to be repatriated, fearing death in their homeland. To them, the barbed wire of Oklahoma was safer, even sacred compared to the freedom Stalin promised. One U.S. Army liaison later summarized the situation in his debriefing. They saw our food, our fairness, our faith, and they knew. America wasn't winning because it was cruel. It was winning because it was right. Legacy in the dust. That day, as the baseball game ended and the sun dropped below the Oklahoma hills, Corporal Dawson shook hands with Mikhail Vronsky across the baseline. Vronsky's daughter, holding her father's hand, asked in halting English, "When can we go home?" He looked down at her, then at the flag waving over the compound. "I think we already are," he said. In a war defined by destruction, Camp Gruber stood as a paradox, a place where enemies rediscovered humanity, where compassion became a weapon, and where victory was measured not by body counts, but by acts of grace. By the time 1944 turned to 1945, America had proven something staggering, that its true power wasn't in its tanks or bombs, but in its character. Even behind barbed wire, that character shone so bright it could blind the darkest tyrants. The most powerful weapon in America's arsenal during World War II wasn't the B-29 Superfortress or the M1 Garand rifle. It was a plate of food. In the winter of 1944, at Fort Reno, Oklahoma, Kitchen Sergeant Walter Jenkins stared at the ledger. It didn't lie. Every day, over 1,500 POWs, many of them Soviet conscripts once forced to wear Nazi uniforms, were consuming 3,500 calories per man. Eggs, fresh milk, boiled beef, carrots and potatoes, sometimes even ice cream. That same winter, in Stalag 326 inches, Sen, Germany, the average Soviet POW was surviving, if you could call it that, on 800 calories per day. Mostly turnip broth, sometimes grass, often nothing. The survival rate for Soviet prisoners in German custody was a brutal 37%. Nearly 3 million Soviet soldiers died in German captivity, many from starvation. And yet, inside a barbed wire compound in Oklahoma, those same kinds of men captured while fighting for the enemy were gaining weight, learning English, and writing thank you letters to American cooks, America's quiet weapon. At first, Sergeant Jenkins thought it was a mistake. "We're feeding the enemy better than we feed ourselves," he muttered to another guard. But the orders came from the top. The U.S. War Department, following the 1929 Geneva Convention, mandated that every POW receive the same caloric intake and medical treatment as an American soldier. The logic was simple and uniquely American. We beat fascism by being better than it. Menus rotated weekly. Monday, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, canned peaches Tuesday, ham and bean soup, cornbread, coffee Friday, fish, rice, steamed greens Sundays, sometimes pie. Yes, pie. And when the Red Cross came for inspections, they found clean kitchens, warm barracks, and healthy prisoners. The 1944 report from the International Committee of the Red Cross stated, "Prisoners appear well fed and housed. Physical health indicators are higher than initial intake levels in 84% of cases examined." In contrast, the German High Command had systematically starved Soviet prisoners as a matter of policy. Hitler had personally approved the hunger plan, which designated Soviet POWs as subhuman and unworthy of rations. By 1942, corpses lined German camps daily. Eyewitness reports from Stalag 352 near Minsk told of prisoners eating bark, rats, and one another to survive. But in Oklahoma, one Russian POW, Vladimir Orlov, who had been captured near Salerno while serving in a German unit, wrote the following in a letter that was intercepted by Soviet agents. "They gave me bread, cheese, and butter 3 times a day. If this is captivity, may I never be free again." That letter never reached his family. Soviet policy considered anyone who surrendered a traitor. Letters from POWs held in American camps were routinely destroyed or censored by Stalin's intelligence services. Why? Because what was happening in America undermined everything the totalitarian world claimed about the West. More than survival transformation, Fort Reno didn't just feed stomachs, it fed minds. Camp libraries stocked by the YMCA War Prisoners Aid Program provided Russian language books, translated American newspapers, and even cookbooks. POWs were allowed to cook on certain holidays. A Thanksgiving meal in 1944 saw Russian POWs help prepare roasted turkey with cranberry sauce, a dish none had ever seen before. Guards noted that prisoners often sent recipes home in their censored letters. One sergeant recalled reading an intercepted message, "Dear Mother, they have a food here called peanut butter. It is brown and sweet and sticks to your teeth. I do not understand it, but I love it." By 1945, Fort Reno's POWs had gained, on average, 12 to 25 pounds each. The same year, reports from Soviet repatriated POWs returning from Germany described men who weighed under 100 pounds, with broken teeth, frostbitten limbs, and signs of cannibalism. One former Wehrmacht officer, interrogated after his return to Berlin, told his superiors, "You should pray your children never see an American cafeteria. One taste, and they'll never salute you again." America's real message, it wasn't about kindness, it was about something deeper. Feeding your enemy and doing it with pride is a declaration of total dominance. The United States had such overwhelming industrial might that it could mass-produce tanks and tomato soup in the same week. At the peak of the war in 1944, American industry was producing 96,318 aircraft, 49,234 tanks, 27,000 artillery pieces, over 21 billion pounds of food. Willow Run factory in Michigan built one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. And while Germany was struggling to deliver food to its own army, America was feeding the enemy with surplus. That wasn't weakness, that was power. The cafeteria that broke ideologies one night, Russian POW Sergei Antonov pulled aside a guard named Tom Murphy and asked him something strange. "If I work in your kitchen forever," he said, "can I stay here forever?" He wasn't joking. Later, Antonov explained why. "In my country, they give orders. Here, they give lunch. I would rather eat than obey." This wasn't lost on American officers. Colonel Henry Willis, commander of Fort Reno's POW program, wrote, "If they return to their nations and speak truth, we may plant a seed that lives longer than any empire." But not all seeds were allowed to grow. By 1945, the US was forced to begin repatriating Soviet POWs under pressure from Stalin. Many of the men fed at Reno and Gruber were put on trains bound for a future darker than anything they had seen behind American fences. Still, they left fed. They left healthy. They left with the taste of freedom, literal and figurative, still on their tongues. The saxophone's cry floated through the cold Oklahoma air like a message from another world. Inside the recreation hall at Camp Gruber, 20 Soviet-born POWs sat mesmerized, watching Private Earl Boots Coleman, an army band member, tap out a rhythm on an upright piano. Then came the trumpet, bold and free, cutting through the smoke-filled air like truth through tyranny. None of the prisoners had ever heard music like this before. No rigid marches, no sterile anthems, just pure American jazz, defiant, playful, alive. It was 1944, and this wasn't a concert, it was a conversion. A weapon that couldn't be outlawed. The United States knew it wasn't just fighting a war of tanks and planes, it was fighting a war of values. While Stalin demanded obedience and Hitler enforced ideology, America wielded something the dictators couldn't control: culture. That's why, at dozens of POW camps across the country, including Fort Reno and Camp Gruber, US soldiers hosted jazz nights not just for themselves, but for the prisoners. These weren't isolated events. The YMCA War Prisoners Aid Program shipped hundreds of musical instruments to POW camps. Camp bands were formed, sheet music translated into German and Russian. Jazz, swing, blues, they weren't just entertainment, they were windows into the soul of a free people. At Camp Gruber, the prisoner music club included both German and Russian POWs. But it was the Russians, many of whom came from villages where dancing was banned and radios censored, who responded most intensely. POW Leonid Smirnov, a former Red Army radio operator conscripted by the Germans and captured near Monte Cassino, later recalled, "They played a song called Take Thee a Train. I didn't know the words, but I knew it meant something. It felt like breathing." The Sound of Liberty American Guards noticed a pattern. After music nights, Russian prisoners were less combative, more curious, more open. Some even began learning English through jazz lyrics. One interpreter at Fort Reno, Sergeant Calvin Moore, said they weren't humming the Soviet anthem anymore. They were humming Glenn Miller. By late 1944, the camp orchestra had over 30 members, including 7 former Russian soldiers. They held weekly performances, mixing Russian folk songs with American standards. The guards didn't stop them, they encouraged it. A secret report by a visiting Red Cross delegate in December 1944 noted, POWs exhibit increasing familiarity with American music and cultural forms. Some interpret this as recreation, others see it as transformation. He was right. In the Soviet Union, jazz was considered bourgeois pollution, often banned or censored. Musicians were arrested. Instruments destroyed. But in America, even inside a prison camp, it was offered freely as a gift. A cultural explosion music was just the beginning. At Camp Gruber, Russian POWs were also introduced to comic books, translated and read aloud by bilingual staff, Hollywood films like Casablanca and Yankee Doodle, Dandy Square Dancing, taught by local volunteers, radio soap operas and baseball commentary. The result? A camp that felt more like a university than a prison. Guards reported seeing Russian POWs debate American movies, imitate swing dances, and form skits mocking Hitler and Stalin, something unthinkable back home. One diary entry from a Russian prisoner, identified only as Mikhail V, read, "They let us laugh here, I had forgotten how that felt. I don't even care if they win the war, I care that they're not afraid of music. Enemy shock and silent panic." This didn't go unnoticed by the enemies of freedom. Soviet officials, already uneasy about the humane conditions in US camps, sent NKVD agents to interview returnees after the war. They were stunned by what they heard. One agent wrote in a report uncovered decades later, the prisoners did not resist repatriation, they feared it. Their hearts and minds were no longer Soviet. They had been Americanized. In Berlin, Goebbels' propaganda machine tried to spin stories of US decadence and jazz corrupting the minds of soldiers. But the truth had already spread through the POW networks. Even captured German officers admitted it. In a debriefing, Colonel Heinz Kruger stated, "The Americans used music the way we used fear. But theirs worked better. Freedom at 120 beats per minute." The most iconic moment of Camp Gruber's jazz campaign came during Christmas 1944. Under a makeshift stage framed with tinsel and Red Cross banners, American soldiers performed alongside POWs in a joint concert for over 700 attendees, guards, prisoners, local townsfolk. They opened with Silent Night, then came Chattanooga Choo Choo, then, astonishingly, God Bless America, played by a band made up of men who had once sworn allegiance to the swastika or the hammer and sickle. No one protested, no one objected, some even wept. That night, a guard captain named Eli Harris turned to his chaplain and said, "We didn't just win a war, we're winning souls." Legacy in the notes. After the war, many Russian POWs were forcibly repatriated, a dark chapter covered in future chapters. Some never made it home, some disappeared. But their letters, songs and memories lived on. Camp Gruber had become a living jukebox of American ideals, free expression, laughter, choice, creativity. And though some prisoners returned to a life of silence, what they heard in those barracks never left them. A trumpet in Oklahoma had done what no bullet could. It had opened a heart. In a wooden chapel just beyond the main compound at Camp Gruber, an old Orthodox priest held a cross fashioned from scrap lumber. His voice trembled as he recited the divine liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, the ancient words echoing in a place they never should have reached, a US Army-run POW camp in the middle of wartime Oklahoma. Around him stood dozens of Russian POWs, heads bowed, hands folded. Some wept, some stood frozen. A few made the sign of the cross with trembling fingers, a gesture that could have gotten them executed back home, and just outside the chapel door, Captain Thomas Keegan, a US Army chaplain from Ohio, stood at attention, watching, listening, and making sure the enemy's right to worship was protected with the full force of the American flag. God behind the wire. It was 1944, and Stalin's Soviet Union had declared war not just on the Nazis, but on God himself. Churches were shuttered, icons destroyed, and Orthodox priests executed by the tens of thousands. Under Soviet law, any soldier who admitted faith could be blacklisted, imprisoned, or worse. Yet here in America, in the most unlikely of sanctuaries, faith was not only allowed, it was protected. The Geneva Convention of 1929 required that all POWs be allowed to practice religion. But the United States went further than that. The War Department's chaplain service ordered that prisoners be given access to translators for sacred texts, designated religious spaces, chaplain oversight for multiple faiths including Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and even Jewish services at Camp Gruber and Fort Reno. This policy wasn't just written, it was lived. Keegan, a Catholic priest commissioned into the U.S. Army in 1942, had no obligation to support enemy clergy. But when he learned that some of the Russian POWs wanted to hold an Easter service complete with candles, icons, and chanting, he acted. He wrote to his commanding officer, "If these men can kneel and speak the name of God again, then we've already beaten their masters." Within a week, the YMCA delivered religious materials, and local Orthodox volunteers helped build a small altar in the corner of the mess hall. By Easter Sunday, it had been transformed into something sacred. The return of the cross for POW Anatoly Gurev, a former Red Army tank driver captured while serving under German command. It was the first time he had seen an icon since he was 8 years old. His village priest had been shot by the NKVD in 1933. The church burned. His mother, a devout believer, was arrested for hiding a Bible. In a diary later recovered by Swiss Red Cross officials, Anatoly wrote, "They imprisoned me, and then they gave me God. Only in America is such a thing possible." That wasn't hyperbole. In Nazi camps, Soviet POWs were treated like cattle. In Soviet camps, they were treated like traitors. In American camps, they were treated like men. Camp chaplains documented the increase in prisoner morale after services were held. At Camp Gruber, Russian POWs volunteered to build benches, craft candles from wax, and copy liturgies by hand. They formed choirs. They organized feast days. They remembered who they were. One POW was overheard saying, "They took our flag, they took our freedom, but here they gave us back our soul." Resistance from the East. Of course, not everyone approved. By mid-1944, Soviet consular agents operating under diplomatic immunity in the US began hearing reports of Orthodox services in US-run POW camps. They were furious. In a letter sent from the Soviet embassy to the US War Department, referenced in barbed wire diplomacy, a Soviet official demanded the immediate cessation of all religious indoctrination of Soviet citizens in captivity. The Americans refused. One colonel replied in writing, "The United States does not suppress the conscience of men. Even our enemies are free to pray." That reply reached Moscow. According to debriefing files obtained after the war, many returned Soviet POWs were questioned about religious contamination, a term used by Stalin's intelligence services to describe any revival of faith. Some were executed, some disappeared, but some remembered. Faith as a weapon of freedom, Captain Keegan continued holding services until the war's end. He led Catholic Mass for American troops in the morning, then helped coordinate Orthodox liturgy for Russian POWs in the afternoon. He once wrote in his chaplain's log, "Every candle lit in this camp is one more light that tyranny cannot put out," and it was working. Reports from Red Cross inspectors confirmed that POWs attending religious services were more peaceful, more cooperative, and less likely to attempt escape. Not because they feared punishment, but because they found something to live for. For America, this wasn't just good policy, it was strategic morality. Where the enemy imposed silence, America allowed song. Where totalitarians crushed belief, America handed out Bibles, and it scared the hell out of them. A memory that lived on after the war. As repatriation began, a handful of Russian POWs tried to remain in the US, citing fear of religious persecution. Few were allowed to stay. But one did. Sergei Kravchenko, a choir member at Gruber who eventually settled in Argentina and later wrote, "I do not know if I believe in nations anymore, but I believe in the God I met in Oklahoma." He wasn't alone. By letting enemies worship freely even when their own nations forbade it, America didn't just win battles, it resurrected hope. Behind barbed wire, under an enemy's flag, in a time of world war, faith lived again because America said it could. The gate creaked open, and Anna Vronskaya stepped through, her boots kicking up Oklahoma dust. In her arms, wrapped in a wool blanket sent by the Red Cross, was a 3-year-old girl, Sophia. Waiting behind the fence was Mikhail, a Soviet POW who had once fought in Italy in a German uniform. He dropped his rake and sprinted toward them, stumbling past stunned guards, mouth wide open in disbelief. It was September 1944. While Europe was tearing itself apart and Stalin branded all captured soldiers as traitors, the United States of America did the unthinkable. It reunited enemy families inside a wartime prison camp. How did this even happen? In theory, it wasn't possible. The Geneva Convention guaranteed humane treatment of prisoners, but not reunification with their wives and children. No other nation, not Britain, not France, certainly not Germany or the Soviet Union, would have allowed it. But in America, morality was policy. Under the guidance of Lieutenant Colonel William Teague, stationed at Camp Gruber, a proposal reached Washington in mid-1944. It stated, "Several POWs have family members identified in Allied-controlled territories. Humanitarian organizations request they be relocated near the holding camp for health and integration purposes." Remarkably, the War Department approved. Working through the American Red Cross, UNRRA, United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, and assistance from the YMCA, select families, primarily displaced wives and children of Russian-born POWs, were flown or transported from refugee centers in Naples, Cairo, and Algiers to US soil. They were settled in civilian housing just outside the fence lines of camps, like Fort Reno and Camp Gruber. In some cases, the women were allowed work assignments, laundry, gardening, sewing. The children were allowed to attend classes in makeshift schools staffed by local volunteers and camp chaplains. The most astonishing part? They were allowed inside the camp for visitation, supervised but unarmed, often for hours each day. The story of Vronsky's Mikhail. Vronsky was a Red Army mechanic captured in 1943 near Salerno, Italy, while serving in a German auxiliary unit. After his capture, he was transferred to Camp Gruber. His wife Anna and their daughter were discovered in a UN refugee camp outside Naples. When a Red Cross worker recognized the family name, a match was made. Teague moved mountains to bring them over. A chaplain's note from October 1944 described the reunion. The man fell to his knees. He kissed her boots. The child kept saying one word over and over, "Papa." The Vronskys weren't alone. Records show at least 18 families were allowed to live near or visit Russian-born POWs in Oklahoma between 1944–45. Each story was different. All shared one common truth: only America would have allowed it. Enemy eyes watching Soviet agents stationed in Washington learned of these reunions through intercepted correspondence and Red Cross liaison briefings. Their reaction was immediate and brutal. One cable from the Soviet embassy to Moscow, dated November 1944, read, "American policy compromises the discipline and loyalty of former Soviet citizens. Family reunification is a counter-revolutionary infection." They weren't wrong, but not for the reason they feared. For POWs like Vronsky, the reunification shattered the worldview they'd been forced to accept. He later wrote, as recorded by Red Cross liaison Bertram Worth, "If I am a prisoner, why does the enemy give me my child? If I am the traitor, why does America treat me like a man?" This realization that liberty could reach even through barbed wire was more effective than any propaganda leaflet. The American gamble. Not all US officials supported the policy. Some feared security risks, emotional instability among the prisoners, or international backlash. But Colonel Henry Willis, overseeing operations at Fort Reno, defended it. "We are not raising enemy morale. We are dismantling enemy ideology." And he was right. POWs who had once feared execution upon return now longed to remain in America. Many saw their families acclimate to local culture. Children played baseball with guards' kids. Women joined quilting circles. In one case, a POW's wife joined a local church choir in full Russian and sang alongside Americans in a Christmas recital. It was surreal and real. And it happened because America allowed it. A photograph and a promise-won iconic photo survives from this era. A Russian POW, still wearing his issued khaki jacket, kneels beside his wife and daughter. Behind them stands a US guard, not with a gun drawn, but holding a teddy bear for the little girl. That image was later censored in Soviet archives. But in America, it lived on as proof that character wins wars, not cruelty. As one chaplain put it, "They will forget the bread, they will forget the fences, but they will never forget that we gave them their family back." Closing note, the Vronskys were separated again in 1945 when repatriation orders came. Mikhail was sent back to the Soviet Union. Anna and Sophia disappeared from the records, believed to have sought asylum in Sweden. But in his final letter, smuggled out with the help of a sympathetic guard, Mikhail wrote, "For 3 months, I lived like a human being again. That is more than many men ever know. Tell America, thank you." In the chow line at Fort Reno, a German prisoner named Wilhelm Hartmann stared at his tray like it was a hallucination. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, apple slices, coffee, and God help him, a slice of real buttery apple pie. Behind him, a former Soviet soldier, Pavel Dugin, whispered in disbelief, "I haven't seen this much food since before the war." That same week, 4,000 miles away, German civilians were boiling weeds for soup. Soviet prisoners in Nazi custody were dying by the thousands of starvation. Even Hitler's own soldiers were rationed to half rations on the Eastern Front. But in America, prisoners of war were gaining weight. This wasn't a mistake. It was the inevitable result of American economic dominance, a dominance so overwhelming that it crushed empires without needing to crush every enemy. The arsenal of humanity. By 1944, America's war production engine had become a force of nature. The numbers alone were impossible to comprehend. 96,000 aircraft, 49,000 tanks, 27,000 artillery pieces, 47 billion rounds of ammunition, and over 21 billion pounds of food, all produced in one calendar year. The Willow Run plant in Michigan rolled out one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Ford Motor Company, once famous for the Model T, was churning out bombers and Jeeps around the clock. In the Midwest, entire towns like Waterloo, Iowa, and Hastings, Nebraska, had been transformed into agricultural fortresses feeding the US Army and hundreds of thousands of enemy POWs. The war economy wasn't just meeting needs, it was outproducing the imagination. POWs as witnesses to abundance inside camps like Fort Reno and Camp Gruber. That industrial might translate it into something tangible, and for the prisoners, unforgettable. Each POW received 3,500 calories per day per Geneva Convention regulations, fresh produce from local farms, real meat 3-5 times per week, access to clothing, hygiene, and basic medical care. According to a 1,944 Swiss Red Cross report, POWs in American custody had higher average health metrics after 6 months of imprisonment than when they arrived. The same report stated, "Prisoners' physical condition improves under American custody. Conditions exceed minimum standards by wide margins." The contrast with Axis policies was staggering. In German camps, Soviet POWs received less than 1,000 calories per day. Many froze in the winter with no boots, sharing lice-ridden barracks and sleeping on straw. At Stalag the 8th A, men starved to death next to full warehouses kept deliberately from them by Nazi guards. In America, POWs worked on local farms and were paid in scrip to spend at the camp store. They bought soap, razors, even chewing gum and magazines. One Russian prisoner, Dmitry Kozlov, wrote in his journal, "They pay us for labor. We buy American goods. In Russia, we dig graves for free." A shocking encounter. During a Red Cross tour of Fort Reno, a Swiss delegate asked a POW from Eastern Europe what he thought of his American captors. The man didn't hesitate. "Your country has so much, you don't know what to do with it, so you feed your enemies." When that quote reached Soviet handlers back in Moscow, they exploded. To Stalin, this was ideological sabotage, not just feeding prisoners, but letting them see the wealth of capitalism with their own eyes. And it wasn't just food. POWs were issued new boots, lined jackets, personal soap, shaving kits, and seasonal clothing. Camp Gruber's commissary even distributed wool gloves in winter, despite shortages in frontline units overseas. The POWs noticed. One German soldier was overheard saying to a Russian cellmate, "They give us more here than Hitler gives his generals. The cost and the choice, all of this came at a cost." Feeding and housing over 425,000 Axis POWs inside America was not cheap. But America didn't flinch. Why? Because it could. The war effort consumed 40% of the US federal budget, but US production outpaced every Axis nation combined. America was producing so much food and equipment that feeding prisoners was a logistical decision, not a burden. But there was a deeper reason. The United States chose to uphold its values. Colonel Henry Willis wrote in an internal army memo, "The way we treat these men is how we define ourselves. Let the world remember that America did not abandon decency in war," and they did remember. Soviet defectors and even some German POWs would later testify that their time in American camps was the first moment they realized how much their leaders had lied to them. The fear of prosperity, Stalin's agents were terrified of what this meant. If Soviet prisoners returned with stories of American generosity, warm meals, and working toilets, what would happen to loyalty back home? One classified NKVD report later uncovered stated, "Exposure to American wealth and moral indulgence produces disloyalty. Physical comfort equals ideological erosion." They were right. POWs like Pavel Dugin applied to stay in the US after the war. He wrote, "I saw my country's lies the moment I tasted your bread. I cannot go back to famine." He was denied. Forced repatriation policies would soon begin. But for a moment, a powerful, unforgettable moment, America showed the world something dangerous to tyrants, that even its enemies could live better inside American fences than as free men under dictators. A closing note. When asked by an army reporter in 1945 why he kept baking pies for prisoners, Sergeant Harold Buck Davis, a cook at Camp Gruber, replied, "Because I can." That's what being American means. It wasn't arrogance, it was truth. America had more. America gave more. And even in war, America's abundance became its most powerful weapon. Each morning before roll call at Fort Reno, guards would walk past a small wooden shack behind the library. It smelled of ink, dust, and damp paper. Inside, Russian and German POWs sat hunched over typewriters, sketch pads, and translation books. What were they doing? Printing a newspaper. The Reno Echo, a 12-page weekly printed in both German and Russian, became one of the most radical acts of psychological warfare in the entire war, not because it lied, but because it told too much truth. The editorial staff were not Americans. They were enemy soldiers, prisoners working under US oversight. And yet, inside those pages, you'd find things like translated articles from Stars and Stripes, excerpts from the Bill of Rights reports on Allied victories, editorials about freedom of speech and religion, and, most damning of all, jokes about Stalin and Hitler, from bulletins to bombshells. It started small, just a bulletin board with announcements about meals and chapel services. But in the summer of 1944, the YMCA War Prisoners' Aid and US Army chaplains introduced the idea of a full newspaper. By fall, over 80 American POW camps were running newsletters, most written by the prisoners themselves. But none were like the ones at Fort Reno and Camp Gruber, where Russian-born conscripts once forced to fight for the Nazis were now writing essays about the US Constitution. One contributor, Leonid Zaitsev, had been captured in Italy and relocated to Gruber. Fluent in Russian and German, he was offered the role of managing editor. In a piece from October 1944, he wrote, "In my country, you are arrested for asking questions. Here, you are asked what you think. It is the most dangerous idea I have ever met." The newsletter staff used old typewriters, worn rubber stamps, and ink rollers donated by local Oklahoma churches. They interviewed camp guards, asked to read US newspapers, and were given free access to the local radio station broadcasts. What followed was nothing short of an ideological uprising in ink. When the Enemy Spoke Truth, one article, published under the byline VD, likely a Russian named Viktor Durov, compared American rations with what he had been given in German custody. "They fed us grass in Frankfurt. Here, they gave us peaches. In Russia, I could not say this. Here, I write it." Another piece quoted Abraham Lincoln, followed by the writer's own observation. "A man who cannot criticize his leaders is not a citizen, he is a slave." These words were printed on US Army approved paper, inside a camp built to detain enemy soldiers. And yet, no one stopped them. Enemy panic word of these newsletters reached Soviet authorities in late 1944. NKVD agents embedded in diplomatic missions filed urgent reports warning that Russian POWs were becoming infected with liberty. One declassified cable read, "The American prison system allows anti-Soviet rhetoric. If these men return home, they may contaminate others." They weren't wrong. POWs who read the Reno Echo didn't just memorize vocabulary, they absorbed ideas. One wrote in a personal journal seized during repatriation, "I no longer fear authority. I have read that men are born equal, and now I believe it." The idea that truth could spread like wildfire through a POW camp terrified totalitarian regimes more than tanks ever could. The American bet. Why did America allow this? Simple, because it could. US officials believed that truth was their strongest weapon. By 1944, the War Department had already launched re-education programs inside camps. The goal wasn't just to detain, it was to convert hearts. This wasn't done with coercion, but with information. Lectures on democracy, free reading material, movie nights with films like The Grapes of Wrath and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and the newspapers were the crown jewel. One chaplain overseeing publication at Camp Gruber said, "Give a man the right to write and he'll never again settle for silence." And he was right. Laughter in ink. Perhaps the most subversive moment came when the Reno Echo published a cartoon drawn by a German POW who had once worked in a Berlin newspaper. It showed Hitler trying to read a newspaper, only to be blinded by the headline, "Freedom wins again." In the next panel, he throws it into a fire which immediately goes out. The camp commandant laughed so hard he had it posted in the mess hall. That cartoon was smuggled out in a letter and eventually reached American intelligence, who began circulating translated excerpts in leaflets dropped behind enemy lines. The enemy may have built walls, but America built ideas. Final edition. By the end of the war, the POW newspapers were shut down as prisoners were prepared for repatriation. Many begged to keep copies. A few tore pages from the archives to hide in boots or stitch into jackets. When Leonid Zaitsev was forced onto a train bound for Moscow in 1945, he left behind a final editorial unsigned. It read, "You can take me from this country, but you cannot take this country from me. For here I learned to speak, and now I cannot be quiet again." That newspaper, typed by hand, printed with borrowed ink, had done something no bomb could. It broke the enemy by setting them free. A Russian POW named Stepan Morozov sat at a metal desk inside the barracks at Fort Reno, pen trembling in his hand. He stared at the blank page. Then slowly, in neat Cyrillic script, he began, "Mama, I don't know if this will reach you, but please believe what I say. That letter never made it to Ukraine." It was one of thousands of letters written by Soviet prisoners in US camps between 1943 and 1945, most of which were never delivered, intercepted by Stalin's censors or destroyed outright by the NKVD. But those letters weren't wasted. They were part of a strategy, a quiet, deliberate act of American resistance that turned paper and ink into instruments of ideological warfare. America said, "Write anyway." From the very beginning, the US War Department and the International Committee of the Red Cross encouraged POWs in America to write letters to their families. Camp chaplains distributed writing paper, envelopes, pencils, and helped translate. Guards took mailbags filled with enemy-written letters and shipped them out knowing full well many would be blocked. The rules were clear. POWs could write 2 letters and 4 postcards per month. Censorship was minimal, letters were screened for escape plans, not ideology. They were allowed to describe daily life, meals, books, even chapel services. Some letters even included drawings, a POW-built chapel, a group of prisoners playing baseball, or the evening meal lineup. To a free country, it was innocent. To a totalitarian state, it was a threat. Stalin's nightmare in an envelope. The Soviet government had a strict policy. Any soldier captured by the enemy, even under duress, was to be considered a traitor. Many returning POWs were arrested, interrogated, or sent directly to the Gulag. Some were never seen again. The idea that a POW might not only survive American custody but thrive, write letters, and describe humane treatment that was unacceptable to Stalin's state security. According to barbed wire diplomacy, Soviet agents posted in Allied countries monitored and intercepted letters sent from POWs to Eastern Europe. In 1944 alone, over 11,000 letters were seized en route from US camps. The reason? Fear. One internal Soviet memo read, "Enemy correspondence presents the possibility of ideological contamination. Information about favorable conditions in American camps must be suppressed." What they feared most wasn't defection. It was the truth, what the letters said. The intercepted letters, many of which survive in US Army archives and Red Cross files, were simple, emotional, and devastating to tyrants. "We are treated fairly. The food is good. I read books in Russian. They allow us to pray again. They even brought a priest. Our children play with the American children. I saw my wife again. They let me think. They let me speak. One POW wrote, I do not fear the guards. I fear going back to silence. Another, tell father I am not dead. I am learning English. I want to be a teacher. These weren't just family updates. They were testimonies, proof that another way of life existed. Proof that the enemy's enemy was, in some ways, more human than their own government. America knew and let them write. Anyway, camp administrators and chaplains knew these letters would be blocked, but they never stopped the writing. Captain Thomas Keegan of Camp Gruber put it this way in a 1945 report, if only one letter gets through, we've already won more than a battle. We've sent liberty where it's never been. Even if 99 letters vanished, the act of writing itself was transformational. POWs found their voices again. They remembered who they were. One chaplain called it therapy through hope, and it worked. Guards reported that POWs who wrote frequently were less violent, more engaged, and more open to conversation. Some even began to question Stalin's rule, not because Americans told them to, but because their own hands wrote the truth. The intercepted Revolution 1 especially powerful letter addressed to Yelena Moscow was recovered by US military intelligence after being handed off by a Red Cross liaison. It read, they gave me a second pair of boots. They gave me a blanket. I sleep without fear, and that is more than any general has given me. That line was shared in briefings. It stunned even hardened analysts. How do you fight a system where even the enemies are safer than your own people? A letter sent forward. Not all letters vanished. Some did reach homes in Ukraine, Belarus, and Georgia. Some families smuggled them through Polish resistance channels. Others passed them from hand to hand, copied them into journals, or memorized their words like scripture. In post-war interviews, Soviet refugees remembered letters like relics. We never saw his face again, one woman said, but we had his words. He told us there was light. Closing the envelope. By the end of 1945, most Russian POWs were repatriated under pressure from Stalin. Many went in silence. Some resisted. A few took their letters and burned them rather than let the truth be punished. But the letters lived on in archives, in memory, in belief. America never demanded loyalty from those prisoners. It simply gave them pens, paper, and the freedom to speak. In a war of tanks and terror, that quiet gesture may have been the loudest act of all. The war was ending, trains were ready, papers were stamped, repatriation orders had been signed. But at Camp Gruber and Fort Reno, dozens of Russian POWs did something no one expected. They refused to go home. One after another, they lined up outside the administration offices and filed formal petitions to stay in the United States, to live not as prisoners, but as free men. They had fought for the wrong army. They wore the enemy's uniform, and yet now they were pleading to join the country that had defeated them. The unthinkable request between late 1944 and summer 1945 US, Army officials recorded over 1,000 applications from Soviet-born POWs seeking asylum, relocation, or extended stay within the United States. These weren't soldiers escaping punishment. They were converts to American ideals, forged not in battle but behind barbed wire where they had been fed, clothed, educated, and treated with dignity. Many cited fear of Stalin's wrath, but just as many pointed to something deeper, a belief that they had seen the better way. Here, I worked, I earned, I read books. In Russia, I dug graves for freedom I never saw. From the petition of Alexei Grishin, Camp Gruber, April 1945, they were prepared to leave behind everything, families, past lives, even their identities, because they had seen America and they did not want to let it go. Stalin's hand comes calling. Unfortunately, Washington had already struck a deal. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Allied leaders agreed to forcibly repatriate all Soviet citizens, even those captured fighting under German command. Stalin demanded it, and Roosevelt reluctantly agreed. That meant nearly every Russian POW on US soil would be placed on a train, shipped back to Europe, and handed over to Soviet officials, many to face execution or imprisonment in the Gulag. The US War Department hated it. Officers wrote desperate memos, chaplains raised moral objections, and Red Cross delegates filed urgent appeals to stop the repatriations. But policy is policy, and the train still rolled. The voices that tried to stay at Fort Reno, Yuri Petrov, a former artilleryman captured in Italy, submitted a handwritten plea to his commanding officer. "I have sung your songs, I have read your books, I have eaten your bread. I no longer belong to Stalin or his Russia. I belong to the idea of America." His application was denied, but Yuri wasn't alone. A Red Cross official recorded the testimony of a POW named Mikhail Baranov, who had been caught weeping during final roll call. "You think we are sad to leave because we are afraid? No, we are sad because we were never this free in our lives." Baranov was 27. He had spent 3 years in a Nazi work camp before being liberated and sent to America. In 6 months at Camp Gruber, he had gained 30 pounds, learned basic English, and played violin in the POW orchestra. He told a guard, "When I played America the Beautiful, I cried. It was not just a song, it was a prayer." The moral tornado American guards, often skeptical at first, became emotionally devastated by the repatriations. Sergeant James Webb, who served at Camp Gruber, later wrote in his diary, "I saw men clinging to fence posts, screaming not to go. I never thought I'd cry for someone who once wore enemy colors, but I did." Chaplain Thomas Keegan, who had spent years ministering to Russian POWs, wrote a final report to the War Department titled, "They Chose Us." In it, he said, "We gave them everything short of citizenship. They responded by giving us their loyalty. I fear we will never fully understand what we lost when we sent them back." Some of the POWs tried to run, escaping camps in the hope of blending into American cities. A few succeeded, most didn't. One was shot trying to cross into Mexico. Their stories were buried, forgotten for decades. But the fact remains, even in captivity, America had become a destination, not just geographically, but morally. The ultimate test of character. In total, only a few Russian POWs managed to remain in the US. Legally, often through intervention from sympathetic congressmen or by seeking asylum in neutral nations like Sweden or Argentina. But even those who were forced to return carried something with them, something that could not be taken away, the memory of liberty. In post-war interrogations, Soviet security services discovered a disturbing pattern. Returnees spoke about fair treatment, religious services, access to newspapers and books, kindness from guards. The regime responded with fear and rage. One Soviet officer reportedly said, "The Americans let them taste freedom. Now they will never be loyal again." He was right. A last whisper of freedom. Before boarding the train at Fort Reno, Yuri Petrov turned to his guard and made one last request. "Do not forget me." The guard, Corporal Matt Jennings, handed him a folded American flag patch from his own uniform. Petrov tucked it under his shirt and disappeared into history. No headlines. No medals. Just one man, once an enemy, now a believer, taken from the dream he tried to make his own. The trains were silent, the guards nervous, and the prisoners terrified. On a cold morning in early 1946, Yuri Petrov, who had begged to stay in America just months before, stood in line at Fort Reno, hands trembling, a small folded paper hidden in his pocket. It was a gift from a US Army corporal, a fabric American flag patch. It would be the last symbol of freedom he'd ever hold. The order had come down. All Soviet nationals held in Allied custody, regardless of how they had been captured or how they felt, were to be returned to the USSR. It wasn't a decision made at gunpoint. It was made at Yalta, the Yalta Betrayal, in February 1945, as Allied leaders met in Crimea to plan the post-war world. Joseph Stalin made a demand. All Soviet citizens captured during the war, even those who had fought for the Nazis or been conscripted or simply happened to live in Eastern Europe, were to be repatriated to the USSR. He called them traitors. He said they needed to be rehabilitated, and in a decision that haunts history, both Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill agreed. The Western Allies, desperate to keep Stalin on board for the United Nations and the final assault on Japan, signed away thousands of lives. The operation had a name. Operation Keelhaul, after the brutal naval punishment of dragging a man under the keel of a ship. It was symbolic, because what followed was nothing short of moral drowning. America's deepest regret. More than 2 million people, including prisoners of war, forced laborers, and civilians, were repatriated to Soviet hands under this policy. Of those, tens of thousands had been in American custody, many of them held in camps like Camp Gruber and Fort Reno, where they had experienced freedom, dignity, and hope. US. Officers hated the order. Chaplains protested. In one letter, Captain Thomas Keegan wrote to his commanding officer, "We have turned enemies into admirers and now we send them to death." Still, the orders were clear, no exceptions. The forced returns begin at Fort Reno. Soldiers like Sergeant James Webb recalled scenes that felt more like executions than departures. "We loaded them onto trucks, no shackles, just silence. Some kissed the dirt before they left. Some clung to the fence and begged. In one case, a Russian POW ripped his shirt open and shouted, 'Shoot me now, I would rather die here than go back.' The guard didn't shoot. He wept. The men being sent back weren't just soldiers. They were musicians, teachers, farmers. Many had wives and children in nearby housing quarters. A few had even fallen in love with local American women. They were being sent to a country that called them traitors for surrendering, even if they had been captured, wounded, or forced into foreign uniforms. The reception committee, and what waited for them at the other end. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police. US officers reported that repatriated POWs were met by uniformed Soviet agents. Some were dragged off trains. Others were lined up and interrogated on the spot. There are confirmed cases of men being executed within 24 hours of arrival on Soviet soil. In a 1947 Red Cross summary, one American official wrote, "These men were not being repatriated. They were being sacrificed. Some managed to escape during transport. A few committed suicide rather than return. One POW at Camp Gruber slit his wrists with a tin can lid the night before his train was scheduled. His note, written in blood on a torn envelope, read, 'Better to die in America than live in chains.' The cover, Up the US. Government, ashamed of what was unfolding, kept details of Operation Keelhaul hidden from the public for decades. Not until the 1,970 seconds did the full scope emerge. By then, the damage was done. But the memory lived on in letters smuggled out, in chaplains' logs, in the journals of guards who could never forget what they'd seen. One such guard, Corporal Eli Jenkins, wrote, "I signed on to serve my country. I never thought it would include sending good men to their deaths." The final act of resistance. Before boarding his train, Yuri Petrov gave a folded note to a young guard named Matt Jennings. It read, "If America lives by its heart, it will never die. You showed me light. I walk back into the dark, but I carry your light inside me." Matt kept that note for 50 years. It now sits in a museum beside a faded Red Army cap, a camp-issued Bible, and an American flag patch worn to threads. What this chapter means America is not perfect. But even in its mistakes, it carries a conscience. Operation Keelhaul was a stain, a moment when politics outranked morality. But what matters just as much is what happened before that. The feeding of the enemy, the education of the lost, the reunification of families, the dignity given where none was required. Even the men America sent back did not hate her. They mourned her because they had tasted something too powerful to forget. Freedom. And for many of them, it had come not in a parade or a courtroom, but inside a POW camp in Oklahoma. The war was over. The barracks were empty. The fences still stood, rusting in the Oklahoma sun, but the prisoners were long gone. And yet, on some evenings, if you sat near the old fire pit behind the barracks at Camp Gruber, you could hear the stories, not from prisoners, but from the American guards who had watched over them, the children who played baseball with them, and the chaplains who prayed beside them. Stories that weren't in textbooks. Stories that made you proud to be American. The guards who changed their mind, Sergeant James Jim Dawson, had enlisted with fire in his blood. His brother died in Italy. He had no sympathy for Axis soldiers, especially not Russians who'd worn German uniforms. But 6 months into guarding POWs at Fort Reno, something changed. I watched them play chess, build swings for their kids, sew patches onto old shirts. That's when it hit me these weren't monsters. They were men who'd never been shown another way. Jim never forgot the Russian POW named Lev, a former schoolteacher who gave English lessons to other prisoners using old comic books and army pamphlets. One day after a lesson, Lev told him, "If I had been born here, I would have worn your uniform." That haunted Jim for the rest of his life in a good way. They hated us at first, but they didn't stay that way, and maybe I didn't either. Baseball and borscht. The children of guards and officers were often unofficial diplomats, playing with the kids of POW families who'd been relocated nearby. Sarah Mitchell, the daughter of a mess hall cook at Camp Gruber, remembered, "I didn't know the word enemy when I was 5. I just knew I liked the Russian girl with the long braids who could hit a baseball better than any boy I'd ever met. They played tag, picked wildflowers, and shared stories even when they didn't speak the same language. Years later, Sarah became a schoolteacher and told her students, "You can find peace in the strangest places, even behind a fence." The chaplains who heard confessions and dreams, Father Thomas Keegan, the camp chaplain who had organized Orthodox services for the prisoners, never stopped talking about what he'd witnessed. Some of the most devout men I ever met were Russian prisoners. They risked their lives to say a prayer. I just opened the door. Years after the war, Keegan told his congregation, "We didn't win the war just with weapons. We won it by showing mercy when we didn't have to." He kept the altar cross that Russian prisoners had made out of scrap metal. It sat on his bookshelf until the day he died. The stories that lived in silence. Some guards never spoke of it until much later. Private Frank Lewis, quiet and serious, worked tower duty at Camp Gruber for 18 months. Only in the 1,980 seconds did he share the story of Sergei, a Russian POW who fixed the wiring in the guard shack after a storm. When Frank thanked him, Sergei simply said, "In my country, I fix with gun to my back. Here I fix because you ask me." Frank said that was the first time he questioned everything he'd been taught about enemies. "I thought we were guarding them. Maybe they were guarding something in us, too, our decency." They went back, but left something behind after Operation Keelhaul. When many POWs were forcibly repatriated, the camp grew quiet. But not forgotten. Some guards kept letters, some kept drawings, hand-carved wooden trinkets, and even photos. One sergeant kept a children's book, in Russian, signed by 6 POWs who had taught his son how to read Cyrillic. "To little Joey from your friends behind the fence." That book is now in a war museum in Tulsa, under glass. But the memories are still alive around kitchen tables and fire pits, the testimonies of Americans who saw something more than just prisoners. They saw what happened when freedom touched the lives of people who had never tasted it before. Why these stories matter. Long after the last train carried the last prisoner east, long after the barracks collapsed and the uniforms were buried, these stories stayed. They were passed down at family barbecues, whispered in nursing homes, typed into old journals, told at school assemblies, because America's greatest moments didn't always happen on the battlefield. Sometimes they happened when a guard shared his sandwich, when a chaplain read scripture in a language he didn't understand, when a child gave a prisoner's daughter a baseball glove. These small acts added up to something huge, a living testimony that liberty isn't just defended by force, it's proven by compassion. "We didn't have to feed them. We didn't have to teach them. We didn't have to care," said one former guard. "But we did, and that's why we won." There were no explosions, no tanks, no headlines, just a POW kneeling in the Oklahoma dust, holding a folded American flag patch to his heart. His name was Yuri Petrov, and before boarding a train that would take him back to Stalin's Russia, he whispered to his guard, "You didn't beat me with bombs, you beat me with kindness." That was the victory. Not the one printed in newspapers, not the one paraded in ticker tape, but the quiet, undeniable win that came from living our values even toward those who once fought against us. The arsenal that didn't explode. By 1945, America had produced more weapons, vehicles, food, and fuel than any empire in history. One B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, 96,000 aircraft in 1 year. Over 21 billion pounds of food shipped globally, but for over 425,000 enemy POWs held in camps across the US, the most devastating American weapon wasn't the M1 Garand or the P-51 Mustang, it was decency. In Oklahoma, camps like Gruber and Fort Reno, Soviet prisoners, many of them conscripts who had been enslaved by the Nazis, were fed full meals, given access to libraries and newspapers, allowed to worship freely, reunited with their families, taught skills in English by volunteer guards. In a world tearing itself apart, America created islands of dignity inside barbed wire, and the prisoners noticed. One diary entry, written in Russian and later translated by the Red Cross, read, "This is not prison. This is proof that another world exists." Freedom couldn't be fenced in America's secret wasn't just economic muscle, it was moral clarity. While Hitler starved prisoners and Stalin executed his own soldiers for surrendering, America said, "We will feed you, we will clothe you, we will let your children laugh." And for many POWs, especially the Soviets, this shattered everything they had been taught. They saw guards who offered second helpings at dinner. They read newspapers that mocked their own dictators. They met chaplains who risked punishment to give them scripture. They watched Americans who did not fear truth, and something inside them cracked and then opened. The war of ideas won without a shot. In debriefings after repatriation, Soviet intelligence officials were horrified. Returned POWs, even those who didn't defect, spoke glowingly of freedom of speech, religious liberty, American humor and music, the kindness of US prana. Guards. One Soviet officer described the effect as ideological contamination. Another simply called it irreversible, but the truth was simple. They had tasted freedom, and once you do, you don't forget the flavor. Even if you're forced to, leave it behind. Legacy in their words, so many stories, so many quotes, so many moments that proved America didn't just win the war, it changed people. From Sergei Kravchenko, POW and choir member, they let us sing. My own government silenced me. That's why I'll never sing for them again. From Lev Smirnov, teacher turned translator, they gave me books, I gave them my loyalty. From Corporal Jim Dawson, US Guard, I went in wanting revenge. I left wanting to be more like them, the men we changed. The victory that lasted. The war ended, the camps emptied, but the effect rippled forward for generations. American children remembered their POW playmates. Guards told their grandchildren about the Russians who taught them chess. Chaplains saved hand-carved crosses made by enemy hands. POWs smuggled home photos, letters, even American flag patches, reminders that they had once lived, however briefly, as free men. And in the Cold War that followed, when propaganda clashed with rockets and walls went up across Europe, those memories whispered louder than speeches. You don't need to drop a bomb, said one former guard. Just let them live next to freedom. That's the blast they'll never forget. What it all meant America didn't have to show mercy. It didn't have to follow the Geneva Convention. It didn't have to let children into POW camps, or allow Russian families to reunite on US soil, or hand out peanut butter and jazz records to men who once pointed rifles at its allies. But it did. Because that's what America is. Not just a nation of might, but a country so sure of its values, it's willing to share them with the enemy, knowing that one day, those enemies might become the loudest voices for liberty, not because we forced them, but because we fed them, respected them, and gave them back their names. Even in war. Especially in war. The final word. No empire in history treated its prisoners with more humanity. No country in history turned more enemies into believers. And no flag in history has meant so much even to the men who were once told to destroy it. You didn't have to win us over, said Yuri Petrov. You just had to be who you are. And that was the victory we never needed to fight for.